welcome to Decision Point. Remember or move on, the legacy of September 11th. Is September 11th a day to remember and to commemorate, or a day to forget one of the most catastrophic events in American history? Today, my guests on Decision Point are Dr. Keith Erickson, the history professor at UTEP, and Reverend Bill Francis of St. Clement's Church. And you can join in on the conversation on Facebook, Twitter, or by email. Welcome, gentlemen. Glad to have you.
Glad to be here.
Nice to be here. Thank
Good.
you.
So what was your reaction? Do you remember that on September 11th when you saw what was going on?
I think my initial reaction was disbelief. I was at home getting ready to go to class, and got a phone call from my sister saying, "You're never going to believe this." And so I turned on the TV in between the attack on the first tower and the second. And so I just remember watching in disbelief, as if a sort of strange movie had come to life, and
I think
it was disorienting.
Yeah, I think it was that way for me too. How about you, Father Bill?
Yeah, I can remember I was driving to church, in fact, and heard the report on the first airplane that hit the building. And of course, you know, at that point in time, it was up in the air. I mean, I think probably most everybody's conclusion was that this was an accident. And then, of course, when you hear, you know, the second plane hitting the second building, then it was fear and terror, you know, that comes to your heart. What's happening? And then when you hear, you know, that this could be happening in other places around the nation, then you know that this is an attack. Right. And I can remember we turned the television on at the church, and it just so happened that there was a team from the Alpha headquarters. We do Alpha at our church, which is it's a program on the basics of Christianity, and we've been doing this now for about 10 or 12 years. And the Alpha team from the headquarters was there at St. Clement's at that time, and their office was just 2 blocks away from where this took place. And of course, they, you know, had no idea whether their colleagues were alive or dead.
Wow.
And so it was a very tense time. It surely was.
Let's take a moment and look at a clip of September 11th and just kind of revisit what that day was all about.
Oh my God, something's wrong here!
What's happening? Amy, are you still there?
We're in rapid descent. We're all over the place.
Can you look out the window and tell us where you are?
I see water, buildings. We're flying low. We're flying very, very low. We are flying way too low. Oh my God, we are...
Just joining us this morning, you're for a horrific surprise. Rescue crews are making their way to the scene, and all of this unfolding in one of the busiest places in the world, in downtown Manhattan.
Look how fast he's going.
He's going right up the Hudson River Center. Oh my God.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices. Secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror.
Dr. Erickson, Do you think that it's important for us here 10 years after the event to keep revisiting these images of what happened?
Oh, absolutely. But one of the things we have to keep in mind is that our memory changes over time. And so those initial feelings we were talking about and that everybody who experienced that day had, over time they sort of become diluted as we see the images again and again and again and again. And so that initial context, the fear that somebody I know or love might be in danger, or that part's gone because now we know what happened. And so as we remember, we also need to remember the original context to see how we can integrate it into the present and the future.
So is it a good thing to keep recalling, remembering these events? Is it helpful to people to do that, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that's one of the things that makes us human beings, right? We remember who our spouse is or who our children are the next day, and these relationships that we have are relationships over time. And so time is an important part of our identity. And so when we start forgetting things, it's a piece of our identity that we lose.
And so the whole September 11th thing is very much etched into the memories of our country, the people in our country. It's become part of the landscape, I guess. The whole issue of terrorism, I think, was brought home in a new way as a result of September 11th. What were the objectives of the terrorists who were flying those planes into the tower?
Well, one of the hardest parts of terrorism to understand are the specific motives of individuals. And we get a sense from their actions, from the results. I mean, we know the main objective is to cause terror, to provoke fear. But they go about it so many different ways, different strategies. And sometimes they'll leave a message somewhere that might tell us what we're supposed to be afraid of. But other times it's just fear in general that they're after, that sort of chaos that comes when you're not sure what will happen next.
So do you think that they've succeeded in instilling a new level of fear in us as a result of that act?
Well,
as a country?
Yeah, I mean, and it becomes a dialogue, right? The more that terrorists try to cause fear, the more our leaders try to reassure us. And so we get part of this conversation. The leaders will create new departments to administer Homeland Security to make us secure in our homeland. They'll initiate new programs. They'll initiate new checks at the airport. And so that's part of the tension. Whether or not we feel safer walking through that scanner at the airport is a different question. But sort of the terrorists and our leaders are having this conversation, and they're trying to win basically our heart, our vote. Are we afraid or are we secure?
How about that issue of fear?
Yeah, I think that the primary objective, it maybe is not fear, that's a secondary objective. I think that terrorism has a primary objective of subjugating other people to their way of thinking, whatever that thinking may be. And the way to do that is to instill fear in the hearts of people. And so we know that radical Islam does have its objective to conquer the world. That everybody should become a Muslim. Now that we're speaking about radical Islam, and so their primary means of achieving that objective is to instill fear in the hearts of people. When you have fearful people, then it's easy to subjugate them to your way of belief, and certainly we understand that as a nation. I personally feel like that we in some ways overreacted to the 9/11 attacks. Never in the history of our nation have we involved ourselves in a preemptive attack on another nation. Certainly in terms of Afghanistan, we had a very identifiable enemy, where there were camps, training camps that we knew were there, that country because they have been subjugated by this terrorist group, we knew where they were. And so I think there may be a justifiable reason in terms of what we did in Afghanistan, but in Iraq we really didn't know that for sure. Yeah. And
so a little more sketchy.
But our objective, our objective was to instill fear in the hearts of the terrorists, that they would cease from their activities. And so you have this, you have the same thing working on both sides.
How about the spiritual dimension of fear, and is Homeland Security going to take care of that feeling of fear that people felt? And I remember how people were pouring into churches and seeking faith solutions and answers to the fear that they felt as a result of 9/11. Of course, that quickly diminished, but
we certainly saw that at St. Clement's. We called a prayer meeting right off the bat, and we had a church filled with people that we hadn't, many of them we'd never seen before, and that they were there praying and calling out to God and asking for His forgiveness of whatever sins we were committing, what we needed to take care of. And for the next several Sundays, we had full church.
Right.
And that's what happens, but it was out of fear, I think that many people were coming, and I think that's the big difference in this picture. You have on the side of radical Islam, the objective is subjugation, and the means of subjugation is to instill fear in the hearts of people. Now again, we're not talking about the majority of Muslims. We're talking about the radical fringe, and it only takes a radical fringe to change the history of the world, and that's what this has happened with that radical fringe. Christianity, on the other hand, it also wants to see people won to Christ all over the world. We'd love to see every single person, walking with the Lord. But the means by which Christianity obtains its objectives is by love. And Islam speaks about the 99 names of God. And many of those names are identical to the names that we attribute to the Judeo-Christian God. But there's one name that is not attributed to the Islamic God, and that is love. And of course, the Bible teaches us that God is primarily love. And so it's the motivation and the means, the method is love. We certainly don't always achieve that. We fall short of that so many times. But that's the big difference between, I believe, radical Islam and radical Christianity, if you will. And that is, one instills fear and the other instills love. One forces and the other influences.
What about now? As you said, the churches have ceased being filled as a result of that tragedy, and have we slipped into a state of denial, Dr. Erickson?
Yeah, that might be one way to frame it. Another way might be that our pastor-in-chief, President Bush, invited Americans back to our other church, the church of consumerism, the church of consumer spending and making our economy go. And not one of the ways that he said we shouldn't be afraid is to go back to the baseball game, to the mall, to your boat, or whatever. And I think that is a part of the way Americans responded. They went back to those pursuits. And we're dealing now with debt and issues on a personal level that reflect those choices. But
what do you think are the perils of forgetting about some of the things that we may have learned and felt from 9/11? Do you think that getting back to, because when you look at research, a lot of it says that as a result of 9/11, people have become more relationally oriented. People are giving of their time and energy more. Their values have become slightly more altruistic, more giving, more with an eye to eternity. So do you think that we've learned enough about that, or we have a lot more a much further way to go in that area?
Oh, I think it's sort of a continuum. There's this balance between our feelings for democracy or society and our neighbor, and our feelings of security and concern. And you know, over the past century, we've seen sort of that relationship fluctuate, right? We want to extend civil rights to Americans. We want to invite more people into the political process. We want to desegregate housing or whatnot. And at the same time, we have gated communities, and we have ways to, we drive around in SUVs with tinted windows where people can't see us. And so this is a give and take back and forth. And 9/11, I think, pushed us to the security edge in some ways, but it also pushed other people to reach out to others. And so I think it's part of this long-term process in American history where we try and figure out what it means to be part of a community, but we also worry about ourselves and our family and our own futures.
Can you think of a time in American history when we went through a traumatic event and maybe learned some lessons and then forgot about those lessons?
Well, historians always make comparisons, and 9/11 has drawn probably the most common parallel that people draw is to the attack on Pearl Harbor in World War II. And there are many similarities, many differences, of course. But yeah, there seems to be, part of it is a generational experience. We like to talk about our nation having a character, but another way to look at it is that, you know, we're a series of generations. For example, my students at UTEP are now, in my freshman class, they're 18 or 19, so they were 8 or 9 when this happened, and they're barely remembering it. Another 4 or 5 years, 9/11 won't be anything that my students have any recollection of. It'll be sort of like when JFK was assassinated. It stamped itself as an event on a generation, but as time passed, new generations arise that need or look for other experiences that sort of unify them as a generation.
And just as the assassination of John Kennedy was a point for reflection and so forth, how do you think that history books are going to portray or are currently portraying 9/11 to our young people?
Well, I hope they portray the fact that this was a singular tragedy. It was devastating. It was awe-inducing. It was shocking. It was disorienting. There are thousands and thousands of lives that were forever influenced and changed because of the experience, the fear, the loss. I also hope that history books will be a place where we can step back and see a broader picture too. And we can see that the United States in some ways hasn't really changed this trajectory. Our foreign policy remains largely the same. Our willingness to intervene in other nations when our interests are at stake, our willingness to take out governments, if you will, that we don't like. We haven't really changed the way that we think about our place in the world. In some ways, we may have solidified the sense of being an innocent nation, attacked on Pearl Harbor, attacked on 9/11. And so I hope that history becomes a way where we realize the tragedy and also we realize the longer context.
What kind of discussions do you have with your students about the significance of 9/11? What do they think about its significance and the whole issue of terrorism?
Well, a lot of the rhetoric that came out of 9/11 talked about it being unique, that it changed America, we're dramatically different. And so when we get into the sources from the time period, whether they're media clips or speeches from leaders or personal experiences, that's sort of the main idea that comes out. This is unique. There's nothing like this that had ever happened before. And our response was unique. The president initiated a new doctrine of preemptive strike or whatnot. And so one of the things that we do with students is help them to see that some of these reactions aren't unique. We could go back to Theodore Roosevelt and his corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he says, we will intervene in any country in Latin America where we think we need to. We could go back to Franklin D. Roosevelt in World War II with his shoot on sight policy. We'll shoot ships and ask questions later. Or John F. Kennedy going into Cuba to preempt Soviet action there. And so that's one of the things that we deal with the rhetoric from the event and the sources, but then we also set it into this wider context to realize that the United States has been a global player. I mean, we can go back to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson figuring out how to deal with, in their age, pirates in the Mediterranean were the terrorists who were getting involved with shipping or whatnot. And so, but to see it in that longer story.
And so is this, so you're basically saying there's sort of nothing new under the sun, it kind of a similar reaction. And Father Bill, in terms of the Bible, we're experiencing that kind of issue way back in the Old Testament times, where the Israelites were attacked and had to learn some lessons from
certainly, yeah, not
warfare.
Even, not just the Old. Of course, the Old Testament teaches us that if Israel, would stray from its traditions and the commandments of the Lord and do what was right in their own eyes rather than what was right in the eyes of God, then God would lift His protection, so to speak, and enemies would come in, and the result of that was people began to suffer again. And but I think the New Testament really certainly teaches us the importance of remembering, and that's what we do at our church every Sunday. Other churches do it less frequently, but we have Holy Communion every Sunday, and the whole basis of Holy Communion is remembering, the most unjust act that has ever been committed against a human being, and that was the death of our Lord Jesus Christ. And but it's been the responsibility of each generation to make sure that we remember. Right. Certainly, the generation of Jesus, and the one after that, they didn't have the direct experience. But subsequent generations have been faithful over the last 2,000 years, for the most part, to remind us of this terrible act that was committed against this totally innocent man. It was the worst act that's ever been committed, but at the same time, it was the act that brought the most blessing of the blessing of forgiveness that has come upon the whole world, and it's changed the whole world. I think the question about 9/11 is, was this act of violence against our nation, and there are other nations that are represented in those two buildings, but was this act of violence, is it worth subsequent generations to do everything they can to teach the emerging generations about this event? Is it worth remembering? I personally think that it was, because of the worldwide effect that it had on everyone. Well,
Mayor Bloomberg of New York City may not agree with that perspective to a certain extent. He, for the 10th anniversary celebration, which is being made a very big deal in New York City, coming up here in a few days, and he has actually banned the participation of clergy and priests in the celebration, and he feels that that is the best approach. Do you think that this is a healthy approach to 9/11? Let's take a look at a clip of a man that is known as the saint of 9/11.
His whole ministry was about love. He loved the fire department, and they loved him. Mayor Giuliani said to Michael, "Come with us." And he said, "No, I have to stay with my men."
Such a striking photograph. These big men, obviously in anguish, reminded me a lot of the Pieta.
Fire Department Chaplain, Father Michael Judge, and our sister Maggie Jeske.
He was our spiritual leader, but he was our buddy too.
Michael never knew he was the saint. Michael thought he was one of the worst sinners.
When terror struck, Mayor Giuliani asked Father Judge to offer prayers for the firefighters in the North Tower. While ministering to victims, he was struck with debris and killed. Who can forget the firefighters carrying his body out of the rubble? Some have referred to this as the American Pieta. So do you think that it is a good idea to erase the faith component of the remembrance of 9/11?
No, it's not a good idea. I don't think we can understand, I don't think we can attempt to understand the actions of the terrorists without looking at the way they define faith. I don't think we can understand the response of Americans without looking at their faith. And I don't think we can understand the stories that we tell as Americans about our nation without the way that religion is woven into the stories themselves and the storytelling, the way we tell our stories.
Right.
Yeah, in the age of inclusivity, why exclude important segment of our society, people that are involved in the church? You look around any town, small village, town, or city, and you will see invariably you will see a church, and in some cases thousands of churches. And so, why would we want to exclude that part of our society in this very important event? I would think that Mayor Bloomberg is one who would consider himself to be tolerant and reaching out to everybody, but clergy excluded.
Well, what lessons have you learned from September 11th? Let us know what you've decided on our Facebook, Twitter, or our website. Thank you for watching Decision Point.